Welcome everybody. In this video I thought I would do a bunch of tips, tricks, and in a sense a bit of a tutorial on suspension. We're going to start with the more basic things and work our way up. Come the end of the video I am going to share with you guys my favorite trick to get maximum speed and ground clearance while keeping your fuel costs down. And just, it's nice and easy. But anyway, let's get into this. The first and most basic choice you're going to be making for your vehicle is which wheel to choose. And is there a big difference between them? Yes, a huge one. To begin with, it's just their straight out speed. If I turn this engine on, you will see the small wheel will go much faster. The big one does get up to, I don't know, maybe half the speed eventually, but the small one is still much faster. If you start running these on your vehicle, you will also notice that the big one, whilst being slower, uses a significantly larger amount of fuel. But that is because you get a lot more torque out of the large wheel, a lot more power. Two wheels wasn't enough before. Put two big wheels on and it may be enough now. You get a lot more power and traction out of big wheels. My trick later on that I'll show you combines both of these effects. I only use the small wheel, but I get more ground clearance and traction than using one of these big wheels. So I can maintain a high speed and stability without a giant fuel cost. Once you've picked out your wheels, you're also going to need to decide whether you want to put suspension on your vehicle. I'll be honest, suspension can cause glitches at this point with the game, but there's also no reason you can't use it if you use it correctly, and don't have too many, don't have 1,000 shocks on your vehicle and it will be fine. I've set up a couple examples over here to illustrate that you need to set the balance on your shocks. These are all set to their default level, but because this half of the vehicle is heavier, you need to increase the value of the shock. The reason I bring this up, I know it's very basic, but if you go too far, now these are not going to give at all, and these will, and you've ruined your handling. It's about balance. The real trick is, or best thing, is to actually keep your vehicle perfectly balanced, or as close to as you can. That way your shocks are all even to each other and can navigate the terrain correctly. Sometimes, if I know I have a lot more weight in the rear, I'll even put two shocks on the rear, just so that I can keep their settings as close to each other as possible so that they all function uniformly. The next thing is, you can actually use this mechanic to your advantage. So on this perfectly balanced vehicle, I can guarantee you if we tried to do any cornering, we would flip over immediately with any kind of speed. Now, we can fix that, especially high speed, like things like my dragster and my common drivers. When you get fast, if you've noticed that your steering gets very light or just completely disappears entirely, you can come to your front shocks and just put them down, just a little adjustment each. That made a huge difference because of all the concrete, but just take them down. There you go. Just a pinch. Just one off from the back, just so that you have that tiny bit of extra, because it changes the angle of the vehicle, so you get that extra downforce on the front, and that makes a massive difference in those times when you're starting to lose traction. Just be fine with it. Big adjustments here will ruin your vehicle. You can mix and match. You can hook up a small wheel and a big wheel to the same engine and it will still work. You're not going to have any problems. It may cause issues with your actual vehicle, but the engine and mechanics will still work fine. At times I have done this to great success because I had some high speed out of my front wheels and good traction and power to help me pull things with my rear wheels. I will show you my tractor. There you go. there's my tractor, and there's the example of exactly that. So the small wheels really help me get a bit of top speed with the engine turned down low, and once I hit the hills and other things when I'm pulling a load, having these big wheels on the back really help me with that low down grunt. At times you'll find you might want to put more wheels on for some more traction, or even just on the vehicles you've got. I suggest you go around and just plop on a second wheel instead of putting in a whole second one. This doesn't cost you any extra components or anything and has the same increase on your traction. The only time I add in more wheels is if I actually need more power, but as I can turn the power up on the engine to suit these wheels, this is my preferred setup. As you'll see with my actual pulling vehicles, I have no suspension because I'll talk about this a little bit more just now, where you mount your trailer or where the load is very, very important as to how this vehicle will continue to drive. So with suspension, when you put load on or it pulls, it's going to lower down into that suspension, which changes where the vehicle is. And adds lag because the game just doesn't like it sometimes with heavy things and suspension. So I just find it better all around to leave it off entirely. The other thing to note about balancing your vehicles with suspension is the moment you're in the air, you hit a jump or a pothole or whatever, the natural balance of the vehicle will take over again. So in this case, if this was the front of the vehicle, every time I go over something, the back of the vehicle is going to drop quickly, causing me to land on the back or just flip out of control, and the same if the front was heavier. If you want to make a stunt vehicle of some kind, or just your daily driver that you use the most, I recommend you keep the vehicle as balanced as you can. That way, whenever something happens, you're not naturally going to spin out of control. It's a small thing, but if you keep it in mind when you're building, it can dramatically change how your creations handle, and that will put a big smile on your face, and that's what this is all about. The final tip I'll give you on shock absorbers, or the final two tips, is you'll see here when I drive around that they're fairly soft. They only just support the weight of the vehicle. That's where your shock absorbers should be, actually working. If they're straight 99% of the time, they're not doing their job. So you need to rebalance things either in weight or soften up those springs. The last note on suspension is you can use it as part of your steering as well, as I have done here. It's normal steering control hooked up to this bearing. It's just that bearing is mounted on the same arm connected to the shock. If you can see that, the whole vehicle is connected via those two shocks. So when I turn, say I turn left, that bearing turns, adds tension and causes that shock to pull in. And same if I go right. This also helps camber your vehicle naturally, which again has a big increase on your handling. Now let's move on to some others. Now I want to talk a little bit about tow points and where you mount them. The important bit to remember here is the relationship between the center of your rear axle and your mounting point. It's pretty simple. If you have it on, see my rear axle pivots there. If I was to move my tow point up to this height or higher, when I drove away it would try and lift the front of the vehicle because it's going to try and pull it over the top of the axle. So if you keep it lower down, when you try and drive away, it's going to try and force the front of the vehicle down, therefore actually giving you more traction. An example of this is I've moved my connection from there to above the axle, and I just keep flipping. With it back in its original position, you'll see that my tractor does not flip. Instead, it gets more and more traction. The more weight you put on it, the more downforce it gets. Which actually means the more power you can turn up in the engine. Therefore, your tractor will always go at the same speed and basically have the same handling relative to it being loaded or unloaded. Unless you run out of fuel. Because that's not going to help anything. To take full advantage of this mechanic, make sure you keep your tow hitch or draw point as far down and back from the center pivot of your rear axle. Remember, the center pivot is where it's going to want to tip, not necessarily where your bearings are. And that should mean that you can pull far heavier loads with a much smaller vehicle and far less tires and grip, which all means less fuel, which is great. You don't need that much power because a lot of it comes from the actual weight of the load. Instead of making this heavy for traction, the load does that by itself. Okay, now it's time to reveal my trick. I normally make a smaller version of this and I put it on all my vehicles. I haven't built a purpose-built Scout or anything in this playthrough yet. But this is what I call my hyperwheel. I know it doesn't look like much, but let me explain. First thing you'll notice is I run dual small tires. This gives me a lot of traction and very high speed, which allows me to keep the power on my engines quite low, considering I'm pulling 2 refineries and everything around with me. This is an insanely heavy vehicle, and it still has pretty good top speed and maneuverability and fuel efficiency. It doesn't burn much fuel at all, as I'm sure you can imagine. Only 4 wheels on each engine. But the real secret is in the shape of the hyperwheel. I don't normally have my vehicles this high off the ground. This is just because I've been building this to get to some very awkward places mining. But it's this concept that I want to show you guys. When this wheel, or either wheel, whichever way it's driving, loses contact, it'll keep going down. So effectively this becomes a wheel of that size. However, when the ground is stable, the wheels are only that round because those are the rollers we're sitting on. Here, maybe a visual will help explain that a bit better than my terrible words. You'll see that they'll change to suit the angle of the terrain, always offering maximum traction. But again, it's all about that amazing ground clearance and all that traction put down. Let's go and find something big enough for this vehicle to actually get stranded on. There are those times when... No, that didn't do it. I forgot how hard it is to get this thing stuck. Okay, so I couldn't get it stuck. I'm gonna try and force the situation with the ramp here. So yeah, there are times that having normal height wheels just won't do. But having a hyper wheel, like I say, means you'll get traction all the way around continuously. You'll never lose traction. Well, not you'll never lose traction, but it turns it into a wheel that size, but also has and maintains the speed and function of a wheel that size. It's what I call my hyper wheel. This stuck on the back of your vehicle, allowing it to swing past the rear of your vehicle like this. You can have a much lower ground clearance. I normally do. That gives you insane ground clearance and traction. This will be able to power and move pretty much any load you want to be able to put on it. I hope you guys like my hyperwheel. I know that wasn't the best demonstration in the world, but if you use your imagination you can understand how powerful that really is. It's just so difficult to actually get this stuck so that it needs it because I've raised it so far up. But that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this helpful.